I do believe that AMD stock is on a verge of a substantial increase in revenue, especially for 2026. That is going to be on the basis of finally AMD is going to be partially catching up to Nvidia when it comes to super large clusters of AI GPUs. Remember that with the MI300, which was launched in December of 2023, AMD had a really competitive chip as a single chip compared to Nvidia's H100 and H200. But once you started to connect those chips together, you could see that all the backbone of this like multiple, let's say half of decade or potentially even more of Nvidia just optimizing software, but also the networking, i.e. making sure that if you connect like 8 GPUs, 8 let's say H100s, and then you connect on AMD side 8 MI300s, even if MI300 on a single GPU basis was substantially better than the H100, Nvidia's interconnect just raised the game to a whole different level. The problem for AMD still has been the interconnect, like connecting the tens of thousands of GPUs and trying to get them to work as a single big GPU. This is something that Nvidia is really good at, and AMD has not been at that level currently. And I do believe this is why the big players like OpenAI, Oracle, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, every single one of them, Facebook obviously, Meta, buy like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Nvidia AI GPUs. When it came to the smaller players though, I think AMD was quite competitive even with MI300. You know, like the smaller companies trying a little bit of these large language models on their own. But again, on the hyperscalers, I think Nvidia has been dominating for the simple fact that the software obviously has been there. Everyone talks about, you know, CUDA and against AMD's ROCm, but I think the bigger issue for AMD actually is the interconnect. They are trying to solve that. So last week, I think AMD raised the bar a little bit. We can see that OpenAI's Sam Altman was really excited about AMD's totally crazy MI400X, which will be launched next year. We can also see there's a lot of discussion from the semi-analysis, and Dylan Patel, in his, I think his conclusion is that AMD is going to struggle on the larger scale until at least MI400. MI355X is a really nice upgrade, but there is a lot of questions regarding the interconnect. How many of these chips are AMD going to be able to connect? The conclusion from semi-analysis is that it's a marketing trick from AMD that they actually are not going to be able to, for example, interconnect, I don't know, like 128 of these chips or even thousands in an efficient manner, which would at some point show their deficiencies compared to Nvidia. But then you see other areas. For example, I saw this article from Marvell in which they mentioned that Marvell expand custom compute platform with UA link scale up solution for AI accelerated infrastructure. And this was essentially on the 11th of June, so around 10 days ago. Then we also see that Oracle is planning to deploy around 130,000 MI355Xs. I'm not sure how many of them is going to be in a single cluster. Is it for multiple clusters? I'm not sure. So I'm really curious to see how this is going to be done. Although there's also some talks that this Oracle deal is probably going to be implemented by end of this year, potentially early next year. Difficult to say. We don't know all the numbers. Then we have obviously the Advanced AI event where they actually launched the MI350, MI355X. Then they mentioned also the MI400 on the same event, you know, increasing the HBM4 memory capacity to 432 gigabytes, which is absolutely bonkers. And this will have, I think, 50% increase compared to the Nvidia Vera Rubin, which will be launched next year. Then again, there's also this discussion that potentially MI400 will actually be entering the market ahead of the Vera Rubin. We also know that Nvidia is completely sold out for the foreseeable future, so any chip AMD can get out there with somewhat functioning low interconnectability, I would say that AMD is in a really good position. And that is why I'm still thinking this is one of the best options out there. If you look at let's just look at the, expectations. So going back to the 2024 numbers, my assumptions is that AMD sold roughly 350,000 MI300Xs. How do I arrive at those numbers? Again, remember that in 2024, by Q2 of that year, they mentioned that they already had sold 1 billion or so of MI300s in that single quarter. They said, I think, something in the likes of above 1 billion sales of MI300 in that single Q2 quarter, which was already the fastest ramping AMD chip in all time. So that was a really nice development for AMD. And then I would say that looking at the total revenue of the company, I arrived at a number around 5 billion, 5.2 billion of MI300 sales. Now that gives us an average sales price of 15,000, around 300 to 350,000 units, which is quite a realistic number, knowing that Facebook and Microsoft were the two largest purchasers and customers of MI300, and I think they combined on around 250,000 or so of those units. So I think this is quite realistic number. Now I might be off by 50 to 100,000 on either end, but it's let's say in the very broad perspective between 200 to half a million. So 200,000 to half a million MI300s shipped last year from AMD. This year it's a little bit difficult to know. We know that Q1 and Q2 is going to be a little bit slower because MI300 is a little bit old. MI325X, although increased memory capacity, it's at the end of the day the same kind of chip with the same limitations of MI300, especially in the interconnect wise, as you're gonna try to scale out and have like 1,000 or tens of thousands of these in a large server hall. So that has always been the limitations with AMD. When it comes to Q3 and Q4, I still expect that MI355X is going to be substantially better than the previous one. And that's why I expect AMD to have around 600,000 or so of combined MI300 or whatever you call it, Instinct sales, right? And going into next year is going to be really interesting for AMD. I would say potentially, if they get this connect when it comes to connecting all of these chips together, like, you know, being able to even satisfy the likes of like Elon Musk and the XAI, the server hall behind it, with like a couple of 100,000. The latest rumors about that is like 300,000 equivalent of Nvidia H100s on that server. So I think it's quite huge scale. If AMD can get to the, let's say, 10 to 50,000 quite stable for all of these big hyperscalers, maybe for every 3 and 4 Nvidia server halls, for the likes of, Google, Amazon and Meta do, maybe they are doing like one from AMD at the scale of 50,000, right? That's the hope for AMD, because on a single GPU kind of design wise, the MI400 is extremely competitive, and I expect that one is gonna be launched on time next year. Whereas when it comes to Vera Rubin from Nvidia, we know that Blackwell had quite a lot of issues as it was launching earlier this year. Nvidia is you still using like one single almost reticle size chip. The die size of this chip is probably, I don't know, 700 square millimeters, 800 square millimeters, very close to the what is like physically possible. And then they connect 4 of these chips right together to get like the Vera Rubin, if I recall correctly. Whereas AMD is still going with the chiplet strategy. So for example, MI300, but also MI355X is using 8 chiplets, right? So each chiplet is 100 or 120 square millimeter or so in die size. Then they connect them together, and they, by this design choice, they can always try to use the latest TSMC node. Why do I say that? Because the smaller the chip you design, this is how essentially Apple used to be the best on the market when it came to their iPhone chips, right? Apple always was first on TSMC's newest node. Why were they first? Because they could actually pay for it, but also the iPhone chip is very small. So the likes of AMD and Nvidia could never use the latest TSMC node early on, because the yields were so low and so bad. They could never use like chips from, multiple hundreds of square millimeters. The defect rate was just too high. Whereas iPhone, when they designed, for example, I don't know, like iPhone A18 chip or A16, whatever it was, it's usually between 85 to 110 square millimeters, which means that, sure, they care about the defect density and the yield, but they are not going to be as affected as the companies that are designing huge chips. And AMD, by going with the chiplet design, they're going to be much more flexible compared to Nvidia. And that's why I think we're going to starting potentially see, like, if Nvidia sleeps with Vera Rubin, potentially there's an opening together with the AMD, like working on the interconnect. But I would really like to understand your point of view. Do you think that even already MI355X is going to be utilizing some sort of interconnect design that's going to allow for like connecting tens of thousands of GPUs, in which would make AMD quite competitive already from essentially Q3 and Q4? or is that meant for next year, second half of next year with MI400? And do you believe that AMD is catching up? And what is the biggest bottleneck for AMD? So anyways, thanks you for your time. Please like and subscribe, and see you in the next one.